Hi, friends. I'm Father Kerry Walters, pastor of Holy Spirit American National Catholic Church, and this is another Holy Spirit moment, this one on the Humanism of Despair. In 1957, a play was published, written by the American poet Archibald MacLeish, that was entitled J.B., the initials J.B. The play was a modern take on the Book of Job found in the Hebrew Scriptures. It became instantly popular. It earned MacLeish a Pulitzer Prize. The play that was produced in New York City was awarded a Tony. It was a box office hit. And I think that was because it spoke to the cultural fears and anxieties of the time. It was just a few years since World War II. This horrible worldwide inflagration had ceased. People were living at the height of the Cold War when they were frightened about nuclear disaster each and every day. The example of the Holocaust from the Second World War was still in everyone's mind, fresh and horrifying. And so it seemed timely to revisit the story of Job, this story of an innocent man upon whom afflictions fell, and who, in response, demanded to know from God why he was being punished. Job, the biblical Job, demands justice. He demands some sort of explanation that will justify the horrible things that have happened to him. Well, MacLeish takes up that same cry in his modern version of Job. It's really a kind of modern medieval mystery play, if you will, MacLeish's J.B. However, unlike the biblical book of Job, MacLeish's play ends on a despairing note, and it seems to me that it is a perfect exemplification of what was so popular in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, a way of looking at the world that I call the humanism of despair. You see it at times in Albert Camus, you see it in Jean-Paul Sartre, you see it in Samuel Beckett, and I think that it's beginning to recur again after going underground for a couple of decades, and that's why I believe it's instructive for us to take another look at MacLeish's J.B. So this is in a nutshell the plot. Although if you're familiar with the Book of Job in the Hebrew Scriptures, you already have a pretty good idea of the main tectonics of the plot. J.B. is a successful business person. He has a house full of kids, and he has an adoring wife named Sarah. And just like the biblical Job, horrible things begin to happen to J.P. One of his children is murdered. One of his sons is killed in a war. Two more of his kids die in a horrible car accident. A war apparently comes to the United States, the same war that took one of his sons, and the town in which he lives is blown up by a bombardment, and along with that going up of the city in smoke, his fortune goes up, and finally, of course, he's afflicted with a horrible skin disease that makes him repellent to his wife, Sarah, as well as anyone who comes near him. Just as the biblical Job had three friends who came to console him and give him advice, so J.B. has three friends that come to console him and give him advice. They have the same names as the names of the friends in the biblical book of Job, but it's clear that they represent in this particular play science, religion, and Marxism, or any kind of secular philosophy that believes it has the key to revolutionizing society and making it perfect, even at the expense of the well-being of individuals. These are the three orthodoxies, if you will, of MacLeish's day, the three magic wands that people hoped would make the world a more just and comfortable place in which to live. Science would eliminate all of the diseases that plague humankind and maybe even eliminate death for all we know one day. Religion will continue to offer pie in the sky reassurance that no matter how awful life might be here, it will be better in the next world. And Marxism promises a kind of secularized utopia if we only have the courage and the stamina to roll with the historical dialectic that's taking us there. MacLeish clearly thinks that none of these three orthodoxies are of any use to Job, to JB. In fact, he has one of the characters in the play say that whenever these three orthodoxies come around, it's because they smell carrion. They feed upon misery. They feed upon despair and death. Now, there are two characters in this play besides Job and his wife who represent, on the one hand, God, and on the other, the accuser, Satan, from the original Book of Job. They are circus performers who are rather seedy characters, and they decide that they will play the role of God on the one hand and Satan on the other. So you have a play within a play, as it were. And they wear masks whenever they're portraying God and Satan. And it's interesting the way in which MacLeish makes these masks. The God mask is one of expressionlessness, and the eyes are closed. There's a sort of complacency, if not indifference, that comes through on the mask. On the other hand, Satan's mask is one of sardonic humor on the one hand, and a mouth twisted in anguished disgust on the other, says MacLeish in the stage directions of the play. And the eyes of Satan's mask are wide open. So the implication is that God is a kind of indifferent, look the other way, bumbler who created a world in which everyone is a Job, as MacLeish says. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of Jobs, whereas Satan is the clear-eyed being that sees just how horrible the world is. And MacLeish in his play will emphasize that horror again and again and again. I think it's interesting and instructive that over half of the play is devoted to the destruction of JB's children and his fortune and the alienation of his wife. You recall in the Hebraic Book of Job, those tragedies are taken care of in very quick order, and the rest of the book is devoted to trying to suss out the implications of what has happened to Job. But in JB, a great deal of the action is highlighting, accentuating the horrors that can befall upon human beings, as personified by the horrors that fall upon JB in his personal life. What's the denouement of all of this? What's the climax of all of this? It's interesting, towards the very end of the play, as the city in which JB resides is in smoky ruins, and as he himself sits in the ruins of his own home, in despair, his wife, Sarah, who has left him for a while, returns. And he asks her, what's going on outside in the world? And this is what she says. She says, there's just silence. There's no sound there now. No wind sound. Nothing that could sound the wind could make it sing. No door. No doorway. And clearly, I think what MacLeish is saying here is that spirit, divine spirit, pneuma, ruach, breath, has departed from the world, so far as he's concerned at any rate. And now what we dwell in is a kind of barren landscape in which it's just one damn horror after another. God has departed. And as a matter of fact, MacLeish seems to think that in the grand scheme of things, it's not much of a loss, because God was such a bumbler to create a world in which so much tragedy and heartache and suffering can occur in the first place. Again, tragedy and heartache and suffering personified by the plight of JB. You look for justice, Sarah tells JB toward the end of the play. There is no justice to be found. God doesn't care about justice. We're on our own. The only thing that we have left to hang on to, says Sarah, is love, not justice. And even that probably isn't enough. The closing words of the play, I think, pretty clearly suggest that. Sarah and JB start trying to rebuild, symbolized by them upturning a few of chairs and furniture in their ruined home that have toppled over. And this is what Sarah says: blow on the coal of the heart. The candles in churches are out. The lights have gone out in the sky. Blow on the coal of the heart, and we'll see by and by. The heart, the human heart, is almost out. There's a tiny ember of hope left, and even though the chances are slim that that ember in the heart can be raised to a flame once more, that's what human beings need to hang on to. In a godless world, in a world in which everything has gone to rack and ruin, in a world in which there is no justice, in a world in which we would be better off never having been born into, the only thing that we have left is the coal of the heart. This seems to me to be such a despairing conclusion, and it reminds me of something that the 19th century philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche said. I don't know if MacLeish was familiar with this particular idea of Nietzsche's, although I wouldn't be surprised if he were. And I think that what Nietzsche has to say is also a symptom of the humanism of despair. Nietzsche has a doctrine which he calls amor fati, love of fate. Nietzsche seems to think, along with MacLeish, that life is a hard and cruel business, but that what we need to do is to heroically embrace the suffering and the cruelty that we encounter in it, to courageously defy the darkness that seems to surround us by saying we love it, and we would be perfectly happy to live the same life that we're living now, again and again and again. That may sound like a humanism of defiance, a humanism of rebellion, a humanism of daring, but I don't think that it is. I think what it symbolizes is a despair so deep that the only thing we can think to do is to embrace the very despair itself and to make it a permanent fixture in the human condition. Now, I don't think that any of us want to argue that life is a bed of roses and that there aren't moments which are appropriately enough ones that call for at least short-term despair. But to insist that life is nothing but a maelstrom of suffering and wickedness, and that the only way we can possibly respond to it, since the coal of the heart isn't likely to flame up again, is to embrace the suffering in a kind of despairing yay-saying, seems to me to be extreme. I wonder, my friends, if this bleak world of JB that MacLeish gave us in 1957 isn't a world that more and more of us are turning to once again, although perhaps in a less dramatic and less felt way. We seem to be coasting along, don't we? Being infatuated with new gimgaws, new forms of entertainment, living from day to day in cyberspace, scrambling to grab whatever golden ring that we think is our dessert, without ever plumbing deeply enough to ask ourselves fundamental questions that human beings really need to ask, the sorts of questions that Job in the Bible asked. And I wonder if that's not all a kind of anesthetic, this living on the surface, that is an attempt to tamp down despair, to tamp down the same sense of rootlessness and directionlessness that MacLeish personifies in the play J.B. And I would suggest to you that if that is part of what's going on, if we are all in silent despair, as Henry David Thoreau said in the 19th century, that a good reason for that is the loss of any sense of transcendence on our part, just as there seems to be no sense of transcendence in MacLeish's J.B. A sense that we are here in a friendless universe by ourselves, and that we have no other recourse than to either leave that universe very quickly by, as MacLeish says, using a window as a door and committing suicide, or in a kind of perverse amor fati move, embracing the despair as the human condition. I would encourage you, if you've not read the play J.B., to go back and give it a look. And as you read it, to ask yourself just how deeply you might be mired in a kind of silent humanism of despair, a way of looking at the world that sees there is nothing ultimately other than humans, and that the human condition is truly nothing to write home about anyway. I'm Father Kerry Walters, and this has been another Holy Spirit moment. Thank you so much for listening, and I will see you again.